Hello and welcome to Dauntless Dialogue. My name's Adam Riva, and with me today I have Matthew Valentinas, co-producer of An Open Secret. This is something that we've covered quite extensively on this channel, but today we're going to be diving deeper into Hollywood's darkest secret. Matthew, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
For our viewers, I'm wondering if you can maybe provide a synopsis for the film and give our listeners an idea of what got you into this line of work.
Sure. A synopsis for the film would be an investigation into the life of child actors in Hollywood and how easy it is for pedophiles to have access to them. And in our film, we have 5 different survivors tell their stories, all from varying age ranges. You know, the youngest we had was 18 at the time that he was filmed, and then some of our others were in their 50s. So this has been going on for decades in Hollywood. And we just show how there is rampant pedophilia in Hollywood, and it's very organized and it's very systemic. And it's almost like it is organized crime in our estimation. And people would not believe, or they still don't believe, but they're starting to, how interconnected they all are and how they all know each other. That this is clearly not just a few random pedophiles. This is an organization of pedophiles who have known each other for decades and who bring in other people. And their grooming methods are highly sophisticated. So the reason we got into this project was because Gabe Hoffman, who's the co-producer on this and the main financier, wanted to do something that would benefit victims of sexual abuse. So that was a mandate he gave me, and over the period of about 6 to 12 months, we finally settled on this, and Gabe agreed to it. And then we went out and hired Amy Berg. And the reason we chose this topic specifically was because when you're covering a subject this dark, you need to have interest to make it commercial. And while we're not looking to exploit the issue, doing this about Hollywood attracts attention to an issue that affects every small town in America and the world. But at least focusing on Hollywood, now we're bringing in rich and powerful people and famous people. And much like the Me Too movement is now doing, we thought that there would be some sort of Me Too movement because this is affecting children. And of course there wasn't, but hopefully we believe that now with the Me Too movement, this will start picking up some steam again. And once people comprehend how bad it was with women, they'll eventually be able to focus on the fact that this also happens to children. And ultimately our goal is to help people feel more comfortable in talking about this and to be able to come forward and speak publicly about it in a place where they feel safe and they won't feel persecuted and they won't feel in danger, because a lot of these victims are still very afraid. Some of them fear for their lives. And some of these people are very powerful, wealthy individuals who can ruin somebody's life even after they've already, I guess you could say they already have ruined their lives, but they could technically end their lives or force them to commit suicide. Even recently, your listeners should look up the article in the LA Times last week or about 10 days ago about Brian Claflin and his relationship to Gary Goddard. And that will give you a firm understanding of the types of individuals we were reaching out to tell their stories. And unfortunately, Brian died or committed suicide in Berlin in 2014. And before, we were able to have a chance to talk to him, but we were able to talk to others. And if people watch the film, for every one person in the film that talks about their experiences, there's probably another 10 to 20 who aren't. So this is something that happens to scores, if not hundreds, if not potentially thousands of kids in Hollywood. And it's been going on forever. So that's why we want to tell this story. And we're never going to give up until the media fully recognizes this and some of the big people go down. So we're committed to this as long as it takes.
And it strikes me, Matthew, that a lot of these people, as you said, are extremely powerful. They have the ability to ruin careers and lives within the industry and outside of. And these are people who are often, looked up to. These are people who are lauded in the public eye. These are lionized celebrities. People essentially worship them, you know what I mean? So for someone to fall from grace in the public eye, who has been on a sitcom or been in movies that we've grown up and we've fallen in love with them in a way, it's hard to doubt those people. It's hard to see the worst in them. And I know that there's people behind the scenes too who are also facilitating a lot of this, as you said, as a network. So there's people, I think, that our listeners would recognize their names, but also some who they might not. Now, I know that just outside of Hollywood, the annual amount of victims of the average pedophile is about 260. So in your line of work and in what you've researched, can you comment on the prevalence or perhaps the amount of victims that one of these individuals might have and how we're not talking about one or two children, right? We're talking about a network that that has a conveyor belt of victims and the way that they've been able to cover their tracks.
Yes, and every pedophile that we've dealt with in the film has had more than one victim, and that's pretty standard. Like you said, I'll believe that number 260. I find that highly likely because none of them are able to stop. And a lot of them have been doing it for decades. In our film, there's a man named Michael Hara, who's probably in his 60s now, late 60s. And I believe he started with managing professionally in LA probably in the 70s. And I even received a call from someone who was molested by him when he was teaching a theater group back in Minnesota, before he even made it to LA. So that was probably the late 60s, early 70s. And he has been molesting kids for decades. So how many? Far more than we could probably even imagine. And he was the head. He created the SAG-AFTRA Child Performers Committee. His role was to basically make it safer for children in Hollywood, working with the Screen Actors Guild Union. And really, the way that these guys cover their tracks is infiltrating places like this and killing stories, or not letting news get out, or giving each other intelligence. Like, for instance, in our film, the LAPD came to the SAG-AFTRA committee about another pedophile in our film named Bob Villard, and they said, "Hey, we just arrested this guy. Will you please notify all the parents you can to see if he molested any of the other children, and to make them aware of who this guy is and if there's any other cases out there." So they had a meeting at the SAG-AFTRA committee to do that, and Michael Hara said, "No, we're not gonna notify the parents. They don't need to know. It's only going to upset them. Let's not do that." So the SAG-AFTRA committee, even at the request of the LAPD, didn't send out a notice or a warning. And that's how things are killed like this. It's the same thing if you go on a show. For instance, I was just watching something last night. The one of the producers of Growing Pains was a child pornographer, and he went to jail for it. He was arrested in the early 2000s. And on the set of Growing Pains, Leonardo DiCaprio, when he was a young child, that was one of his first breakout roles. He was a client of Bob Villard, who was his sort of publicist. Took a lot of photographs of him in his early teen years, and he was the guy that the LAPD came to the SAG-AFTRA committee about, saying he was a pedophile. So that Bob Villard guy represented Leonardo DiCaprio on the set of, and then also on the set of Growing Pains, there was another person there named Brian Peck, who was also a pedophile that we point out in our film. And he's been able to get on sets in Hollywood as what he calls himself, like a dialogue coach. And really, no one even knows why he was on the set of Family Ties, because I don't even think he was actually working on that. Or he might have had some, he might have been cast in one episode, but yet allegedly he's hanging around for all the other shows. So these guys are actually allowed on set to be around these children who back then were really not very well watched. You have studio teachers who are supposed to be paying attention, but many times they don't. A lot of these studio teachers weren't properly licensed. And if you read David Robb's article in Deadline this May, he did a follow-up article on how there's a Child Protection Act, and everyone's supposed to get fingerprinted and registered in Hollywood. All the managers and publicists that work with children are supposed to do it, and no one had done it in the 5 years since the bill was passed in 2013. So Deadline did a big article about it, and now they followed up a few weeks later, and maybe 200 people have done it. But there's more than 200 people in the industry that work with children. And that just shows you how there's no enforcement. Like the California Labor Commission was not following up with proper licensing techniques, was not checking out any of these people. Nobody was going around actually verifying or checking anyone. No one's doing their job. So these children are left at the prey of these pedophiles. And what is a better place than Hollywood for these pedophiles? Because that's where all these children come to be famous and to be stars. And a lot of times their guard is even lower because they're trying so much harder to be chosen. And that's why these pedophiles are able to hide in this industry. And the industry is almost built for pedophiles. And we're going to look back on this in 20 or 30 years and just be, hopefully sooner, but this is a slow process, and just be amazed at how disgraceful and disgusting and lazy the industry is at protecting children. I don't even think children should be allowed on sets, to be quite honest. I think it's one of the most dangerous places for them to be because of the lifestyles out there, because of the drugs. Some of the people involved in the industry are just dark people who use sex as power. And a lot of them like to prey on children.
I'm reminded as you're talking about Jimmy Savile of the BBC, who had posthumously been exposed for molesting over 500 children. And of course, he was involved in so many other perverted, twisted forms of sexual excitement like necrophilia and preying upon the elderly. But I'm wondering if you can speak right now more about the grooming process, because in your film, An Open Secret, you really portrayed how these predators are able to choose their victims, to acquiesce themselves to the families, to become ingratiated, to get closer and closer proximity to some of the more pliable personality types in these children. And also that plays into how they're able to evade exposure. So can you please speak on the grooming process?
Yeah, it's much more sophisticated than people think it is. And one of the tough things that we've had to deal with, if we're reading comment sections, on postings, a lot of these people, or on Twitter, people will say, well, where were the parents? And it's not that simple. These guys are very smart about who they choose, and they take their time. Now, in our film, Marty Weiss was the pedophile who was sexually abusing Evan Henze in the film, and from the time Evan was 11 to about, I think, the time he was 14. And you see in the film, home video of him being over for Christmas or at family birthday parties, and how he's almost become a member of the family. And he did it over a long period of time, and slowly pushing his way in and testing boundaries, and then striking at the right time. And he's often grooming multiple kids at once, so they're in no particular rush. A lot of times it could take months, or it could take years. They don't care. They're constantly grooming other victims while they likely have victims that they're actively abusing at the time. And they know, oftentimes they find a vulnerability, whether it's an absentee parent or a drug problem or money issues or education issues or whatever it is, and they exploit that issue. And then they get the child, and the child is too young to even really recognize what's going on. A lot of times, I hate to see it when people say, well, that actor, they knew what they were getting into. They just went along with it because they wanted the fame or the money or the acting role. And you know what? No, anyone under 18, that's not the case. And I guess you can always argue sexual consent, different states, it can be lower, but depending on what the law is, the law, and an 11-year-old child cannot consent to being sexually abused. So that's what they do, and we see it over and over again, how they get themselves in a position of power, whether, in Hollywood situation, it's an acting coach, it's a manager, it's a publicist, someone who can help their careers. But it's no different than an athletic coach or a doctor or a teacher, which is what we see all the time, or a priest. It's always somebody in a position of power that can also perceived authority, perceived respect, and then they use that position to, make victims of these children. And in Hollywood, these perceived positions of respect and power are very easy to get to. It's very easy to be a manager or a publicist or a dialogue coach or an acting coach. No one's really checking that stuff out. And unfortunately, they get credibility when someone, if they represented a child who got a job on a show and becomes a famous actor, they can say, oh, I represented that person. And then people just believe that they're good. And they're like, well, that child actor became famous and that person represented him. I feel fine trusting me. And that's the same pattern we've seen over and over again. And in the most upsetting, alarming thing that we saw was that a lot of these pedophiles, even after they had been convicted and incarcerated, were able to get jobs in Hollywood when they came out again, working on sets with children. Again, I don't know too many industries that's really allowed. And Hollywood, it was just a normal thing. So that's the shocking state of the industry right now.
And one of the takeaways that I had from your film, Matthew, was that there seems to be a confluence of pressures that keep these individuals silent. On the one hand, as we mentioned earlier, there are powerful men who are capable of destroying your career, destroying your life, blackmailing you, etc., etc. And on the other hand, for any child who's going through this experience, it's got to be extremely confusing. It has to be, especially once they've been groomed by some of these people, who they look at as friends, who they look at as confidants. Well, now this person, this older person, is engaging in a way with them which has got to be bewildering. A lot of these children are prepubescent in some cases, and so it causes, I would say, a reluctance to come forward because, you know, what will my friends and family think? And, you know, I can't even explain what happened. So how can I talk about it? So there's a couple of factors that keep these children and these victims silent. Now, let's fast forward. Let's talk about some current events. More recently, we've had the exposure of the Smallville actress Allison Mack and the Nexium human trafficking cult. And so that's right there in the belly of the beast. I believe she was trying to entice or rope in Emma Watson, right, and Kelly Clarkson. So I wonder if I can get your comments on some of these more current events, some of these big exposures, which for the first time are giving people, a peek behind the curtain.
Well, with the Nexium thing, I know Gabe is really researching that right now. So we're gathering facts, but I wouldn't say we have enough yet to really prove anything related to our film yet. But what I can say is that we do see some connections in some of the people. There are connections. So what we're trying to do is tie them together a little more, and then once we do, we'll let you know. In terms of basically what you're talking about is the shame or the stigma that's associated with this, which makes it harder for children to come forward as they grow up. I think a great example of that related to our film, and where I know our film helped an actor come forward, is with the actor Anthony Edwards of ER fame and Top Gun fame. He came forward because he's in his 50s now, but when he was a young child actor, he was molested by the same Gary Goddard who's in our film. And he tells, if you read his story on Medium, he tells how he was so angry when our film first came out and Gary Goddard was going after one of the survivors in our film and saying that he was a liar and he never molested him and it's all crazy. And Anthony knew or believed that Gary molested the guy in our film because Gary had molested him. And he was so angered by that because he had run into Gary Goddard some years before at the airport. And Gary had promised him that he was done doing this. And I think it just snapped in his head that he realized these guys just lie and will say whatever they need to do to get you to think that they're not doing this anymore, but that they never stop. And so Gary coming out and actually saying that really was great for us, because that's what we need in the industry. We need more. We believe there are many people out there, some very, very famous, who've been molested by people even in our film. But we're not going to out them. They need to do it themselves. And we know it's going to happen. And when it does, it's going to be front page news and people are going to be shocked. But the reason why they haven't done it is because of that, because of the stigma and the shame. And then they're also seeing a lot of people, they might be famous stars who have a really, America loves them right now, but people might turn on them and say, hey, this happened to you. Why didn't you come forward and talk about it? And think differently of them. And also, a lot of them are making a crazy amount of money right now. They're really doing well in their careers, and if they come forward, their careers will crash. And what's the point of that? There's no upside for them coming forward, other than maybe mental health. And often they placate themselves with drugs and with fame and money, and it overcomes these issues. So it's almost it's on like a parallel course. The people that are most affected are either very, very successful, and that success is what's keeping them from coming forward, or they're very opposite and unsuccessful, and they're just wrapped up in in being depressed and having issues and often being addicted to drugs or alcohol and not having much money and not having stability in their lives. And those people lead into, they die of drug abuse or suicide, and they go down that path. It's rarely somebody in the middle, because the pedophiles are very sophisticated about who they groom. So normally, if you're somebody who would eventually say something or talk to your parents or talk to a teacher or say no, then they'll move on. So by the time that they find a victim, it's because that victim has been the, you know, I hate to say it, but has been the easiest prey for them. And often, and they, part of the reason why they pick those people is not only just to sexually molest them, but it's to control them. And they know that these people will never talk about it down the road. And they, practice makes perfect. They abuse so many people that they pretty much can figure out what type of person they should abuse, because now they're going to control that person. And in Hollywood, their ability to control somebody is exaggerated, because A, they can control their career. B, they can also become their surrogate parents. C, they can control them financially. And D, they're usually the first people to introduce them to drugs, often very serious hard drugs like heroin that they get addicted to. And they control them through that. So that's sort of the pattern that we've seen, and that's why there's such a stigma for these people to come forward, because it also takes about 10 to 20 years, even 30 years, most often, for these people to really come to terms with what's happened to them. And unfortunately, until recently, our legal system was designed to really help pedophiles with the statute of limitations. Even just today, and today we're talking on March 18th, I believe, or 17th, Tyler Grasham, who was a fired child talent agent from APA agency in LA, had 4 investigations going on against him by people who are young men now, but who were, some of them were allegedly underage at the time, who said that they were, you know, raped and sodomized and drugged by Tyler Grasham. LAPD, I mean, the LA District Attorney's Office says they're not going to charge him because they don't have enough evidence, and in some of the cases, the statute of limitations has passed. Now, that's the problem. So there you go. Even if you bring out this information, even if you go public with it, even if you get the police to investigate, and everyone pretty much believes you, still nothing is being done about it. And it's tough. I know it's tough on the police to prove these cases, because a lot of it is he said, she said. But in our film, you will see, so this is what I think makes our film very unique. We have 2 confessions that were caught on tape. And generally that is what's needed to get these guys. It's even in the case of Evan Weiss in our film, he had the courage to record his abuser himself. And while that information, he submitted it to the police and it was used, that it allowed them to start the investigation, of course that tape couldn't be used in court. So that's the very upsetting thing about it. And then the other confession that we caught of Michael Hara admitting on the phone to one of the survivors that he did inappropriate things with him, again, that likely wouldn't have been used in court. And also that happened from, 20 or 30 years ago. So it was out of the statute of limitations, but he admitted to doing it. So that's the frustration of these people. And we have to make it, society has to be comfortable in starting to talk about this and to not shame, or we have to remove the stigma from sexual abuse because it's so common. And that's why we wanted to do this issue in the first place, because there's probably someone within 1 mile to 5 miles of you who's being sexually abused right now, a child. So that's why we wanted to do this and raise awareness and show how bad it is and how these pedophiles operate and how they can thrive and function in a power structure and how they use that dynamic to their advantage, and how we need to recognize that and help parents recognize that and help children recognize that and be able to communicate to their parents and to others who they can trust that these things are going on. Because another thing we discovered is you just don't know who it can be. It can be anybody.
I agree. And I think one of the revelations is that this is not a new problem. And I think that's part of what has fortified their ability to remain hidden and to remain free and not get prosecuted, is because, Hollywood has been around for over a century. Whether you're talking about Brooke Shields in the 1980s in Pretty Baby, or going back even further to Shirley Temple, there's been a number of cases of pedophilia that have at least come to the surface that show very clearly a pattern of abuse in the industry going very far back for decades. And we're talking about rich people who have a lot of power and influence, and that power and influence spills over into the mainstream media and into Washington with litigation. So if this is a pervasive problem, I think part of the reason they've been able to stay free and remain hidden has been because this is a much older problem than we realize. This isn't something that's just cropped up in the last 10 to 20 years. Now, one of the strangest revelations, in my opinion, is that there is a statistical inversion upon which Hollywood actually has a higher prevalence of homosexual pedophilia as opposed to, on the more national stage, the children that are most often victims are little girls. So I'm wondering if we can just get your comment on that, and maybe you can propose a theory about why you think that is the case.
Well, what we've come across is that male-on-male sexual abuse is actually likely higher in Hollywood than it is male-on-female sexual abuse. And we all know how pervasive male-on-female sexual abuse is, because that's all we've been hearing about in the industry right now. So there is no doubt that that it's an issue, and I don't know why. I can only say what we've seen is that they're very sophisticated, and there's a good network of pedophiles that work together and sort of funnel these children up from what I would call, and there's going to be at least one article coming out on this probably in June that we've given a lot of information to. And we also have done another extensive interview with one of Bryan Singer's former boyfriends, who gave us a lot of inside information about this network that we have since verified. And within that network, you have guys starting from the level of just guys who hang out at nightclubs like in West Hollywood, and we'll see new talent that comes in town. And then they could even be homeless kids who need a place to stay or an apartment, and they'll either get them addicted to drugs or they're already be addicted to drugs. And then oftentimes what we've seen is that they end up raping these kids, and then they start controlling them from that point. And then they'll try and impress them by bringing them to parties up in the hills of really wealthy people. And then they'll start introducing them to managers and to agents. For instance, Tyler Grasham, who we were just talking about, he started his career in Hollywood based off of a reference and an introduction from Bryan Singer. So Bryan Singer and Tyler Grasham are good friends. They party together. They hang out together. They might have, clients that end up in Bryan's movies, perhaps, or TV shows. And that's the circle that you get in. And from what we've been hearing from some of these victims, you sort of get invited to a party, and then you're kind of supposed to go. And then you might be someone's boyfriend for a while, and then they'll pass you over to somebody else. And if you don't accept that, it's almost like you're kicked out of the club. And eventually, at first, they feel like it's normal, but then they recognize that this is abnormal and that they're just being used like a piece of meat. And that's what happened to Brent Tyler Skopek, who we've interviewed at length. And when we edit this interview and release that, I think it's going to be very interesting to people, because it's really going to give a full side of how this lifestyle actually functions in Hollywood, and how it was functioning basically with no worries for decades. I think since our film came out, they've been smarter about how they act. They've been a little more sophisticated. They're probably not as open as they are. Like, we have examples of texts and Facebook posts and things like that I'm sure today they're not doing anymore, but we have them, and as much as 3 or 4 years ago. So I guess I sort of forgot what the question was, but you had even mentioned how long this has been going on in the industry. And for instance, with Brooke Shields, 1980, she did that Blue Lagoon movie. The director of that Blue Lagoon movie was a guy named Randall Kleiser. Fast forward to the year 2000, Randall Kleiser is in our movie. He's actually working at the Digital Entertainment Network, which we expose in our documentary, and he's directing a film called Chad's Den that the Digital Entertainment Network produced. And while that film was going on, he was directing one of the survivors in our film named Nick S. And Nick S. was being sexually abused and raped as a 14-year-old child on Randall Kleiser's set. And Randall Kleiser is a famous director, or had been, who had done Grease, he had done the Blue Lagoon, he had done The Last Stargate. So, I mean, he had a good career and is still well known and respected in Hollywood. And he didn't even notice that this 14-year-old kid was being traumatized and sexually abused while he was filming this film. And so when Brooke Shields is saying she was sexually molested as a child, and Randall Kleiser is involved, you're saying, geez, he directed Brooke Shields and she was sexually abused, and now here we have him in this film in an open secret that he's directing, and the kid was being sexually abused, and Randall didn't pick up on that. He just happens to work with all these kids that were sexually abused. And then Randall, and if you look at the Blue Lagoon, I mean, that is considered one of the epic sort of uncomfortable movies of young children, right? I mean, that's probably one of the first examples. And that was 38 years ago. And we can still prove a connection to that today in our film. And the funny thing about Randall Kleiser is he was in one of the trailers that we released. And we didn't even know it was him. But because he was in it, he had some big shot lawyer call us up and threaten to sue us. And he wanted us to cut him out of the trailer. And he wanted us to, not mention his name or anything, and try and intimidate us. And we just told him to go pound sand. But, and then later, so that's in 2000. And then later we looked more into Randall Kleiser. And then later in 2005, he's directing another film with Amanda Bynes as the star. And I forget the name of it, but she's in it, and he's a director. And ironically, he had hired Brian Peck after Brian Peck got out of jail for sexually molesting a kid. So he had to know that Brian Peck was a pedophile. And if he didn't know, he should have known, but he still let Brian Peck, a pedophile, convicted pedophile, work on the set with Amanda Bynes and other young actors. So that's the connection that we see and the patterns that we see. And it's crazy. And no one's doing anything about it.
What kind of resistance have you had with trying to promote the film? I know that you've been blocked from a number of film festivals. What's some of the resistance that you have seen in creating this film?
Well, I think that there was two levels. There was sort of one was we were called homophobes. There's a writer for the Hollywood Reporter. His name is Jason Handel. And he wrote a couple articles in the Hollywood Reporter, and then he wrote one in the Huffington Post. And he was always bashing the film. And he was always trying to go after one survivor in the film named Michael Egan, because Egan had gotten in some other unrelated legal troubles, which, by the way, is very normal for victims of sexual abuse. After people are sexually abused, they often go into a path that leads them down the road of drugs or alcohol or criminal activity. It's very common. And it's just because somebody is a criminal or committed a criminal act doesn't mean they weren't sexually abused. So that was, it's ridiculous on its face. But anyways, he would bash us. And he was good friends with a lot of these guys that we mentioned in the film. And he was almost acting, we felt he was almost acting as like their unofficial PR person. So he took a very unobjective opinion of writing about us and attacking the film and focusing on one very specific weird thing while totally ignoring all the other victims in the film and all the other facts that we presented. And he could care less about that. Of course, he would say, oh, sure, it's a bad thing, but you having this other survivor in this film discredits everything else you're saying. And clearly, we saw right through that tactic. And the entire time he was saying, well, I'm writing these articles because, we think that you guys are homophobic, and Amy Berg, the director, is out to get, homosexuals. And he couldn't have been farther from the truth. And that argument really doesn't work anymore. I think you saw that fail again when Kevin Spacey came out and tried to act like, if people didn't already know he was a homosexual, I mean, everyone in Hollywood knew, but maybe America didn't know. But when he got busted for, what Adam Rapp, the child actor at the time, said that Kevin tried to molest him, and then we saw how Kevin said, well, by the way, I'm homosexual or whatever, to cover up the fact that he had been with a child. Again, I think we felt like it's almost like he was trying to hide behind the shield of homophobia. And I think we're at a point in America now that we're sophisticated enough that the homophobia angle is not believable. We can talk about pedophilia and not have to tie it into homosexuals. In our film, we clearly say pedophilia has nothing to do with homosexuality. Nothing whatsoever. It's never been scientifically proven. We don't even try to make that argument, and we're very clear about that. So that's the first thing, the way that we were attacked on like a PR level. And then the second thing that was more insidious was it's more about a liability level, because our film preceded the Me Too movement, and this could negatively affect the industry, and it could open up a huge can of worms. Because obviously the Me Too movement has had a very dramatic negative effect on a lot of productions, film companies like the Weinstein Company's dead now. Bryan Singer got kicked off Bohemian Rhapsody. And you can see how that sort of echoes out throughout the industry. So people don't want any more financial issues. Even with one guy that we were investigating, we were never able to prove anything, but there's a lot of rumors on him, and people are starting to come forward telling us things about him. We suspect that Dan Schneider is also another potential pedophile, and he was recently fired from Nickelodeon a couple weeks ago, and it's been very quiet since. And we suspect that the reason he was fired might have been because Nickelodeon and CBS and Viacom are all trying to do a deal and sell these companies. There's a lot of mergers and acquisitions going on. You just saw Fox get bought by Disney. So maybe Fox was cleaning house with Bryan Singer, right? And now maybe Viacom's cleaning house with Dan Schneider, and they want to get these things off the books because there's billion-dollar deals. Now, that's just speculation on my part. But that's some of the thinking. I'm trying to show you how there could be potential liability connections here in the industry. And what happened with us is this was like a small million five film that easily could have been on like a Showtime or an HBO or something like that. And normally the people that run those companies, they don't need to get approval from the people on the boards or much higher up at maybe their larger corporations, right? But in our instance, where we would initially screen the film for somebody at the normal levels and they would like it and they would want to start negotiating with acquiring it, then a few weeks later someone else would screen it at a much higher level and they wouldn't do the deal. And that happened to us 2 or 3 different times. And I don't want to give out some of the names of some of the people that asked to screen our film, like at their own houses, but we're talking some of the most powerful, richest, biggest executives in the industry. And I'm not that after they saw the film, all of a sudden our potential deals were gone. So that happened to us about 2 or 3 times. And there's only so many people that buy documentaries in Hollywood. It's a pretty crowded market. There's only a few companies that distribute it. It's already a very tough business to make money off of. So without distribution in place, if we had to do this film over again, I think we would have had distribution in place before we went out. But we figured we had an Academy-nominated director from a similar project, Amy Berg, who was Oscar-nominated for doing her documentary, Deliver Us from Evil, about exposing the Catholic Church. So her bona fides were perfect. The production value on this was excellent, okay? We had plenty of budgets. The legal work on this and the clearances that we got were from the best lawyers in the business. So we had extra insurance on this film. Everything was done as good as it could have been to hand off to a distributor where they would not have been sued. But and if you look at the fact that the film hasn't been sued yet, I think that stands up. You know, it's been out for 5 years now and we haven't been sued. So I think we've proven that fact. And the fact that a lot of these companies use that as an excuse to back off was disappointing. And normally you expect documentary film companies to lead the charge on things like this. If this had been a documentary about Me Too, like for instance, now they're doing a documentary on Harvey Weinstein, but it's easier for them to do it after the fact. We were doing this film before the fact. And I think that's the main difference. Now that everyone that's doing a documentary on Harvey Weinstein, now they can claim, you know, now they have the support of the public's knowledge of that problem. Whereas before they didn't. There was a guy who tried to do a documentary on Harvey Weinstein and Harvey killed it. Very similar to how our film was tried to be killed. But the difference with us is we had Gabe, who has the money to put the film out there anyways and can afford to lose his money on this project. So, and also we can afford to hire our own attorneys and protect ourselves. So every time that somebody tries and shut us down, we're able to fight it off. Like even the Screen Actors Guild came after us and wanted to sue us because we outed we outed Michael Hara, and that interview was done in the Screen Actors Guild with one of their PR people there. And apparently David White, the head of SAG, wanted to come after us. And David Robb covered that very detailed, and it looks like David White was lying to the SAG board about how he was dealing with us. And SAG sent us a letter, and they wanted us to edit our film and to cut out any mention of SAG and to not tie SAG into Michael Hara. And we don't even know if SAG forced Michael Hara out or if he just resigned himself or when, because they never told us. And SAG never even sent out a notice to their union members about what was going on or about who Michael Hara is or what was said. They just totally covered it up. And when frankly SAG should have been like doing screenings of the film at SAG and supporting this and working with us to make, you would think they'd want to make the environment safer for children. But all they've really done is lip service. They've never actually enacted anything to execute or to show that they're being proactive. Like for instance, SAG could have went out they could have hired somebody to go verify all these managers and publicists who haven't been properly registered, but they didn't. It took a newspaper to do that. SAG didn't do that. What is SAG doing? Nothing. And that's just an example of how these guys have free reign. It's like letting the foxes in the hen house. That's exactly what Hollywood is right now when it comes to children.
And I want to circle back real quick to something you said, because when people attempt to discredit this topic through saying that you're, a homophobe or something like that, this is an old tactic that just doesn't work anymore. I think when you want to shut down a conversation or you want to silence someone, there's a launch of ad hominem attacks, which, if you want to criticize particular aspects of female behavior, they just call you a sexist. If you want to compare values across cultures, they call you a bigot, without admitting that there are without admitting sorry, we cut out there for a moment, but that tactic doesn't work anymore. And I think it's like the boy who cried wolf. If you continue to yell and scream homophobe or bigot or whatever, that doesn't take away from the facts of the matter. Now, we're running out of time here, Matthew, and I just want to maybe end on a high note, if there is one, if there is a silver lining. Is there progress being made, in your opinion?
Yes, slowly. I think the Cosby conviction was definite progress, and I think the Harvey Weinstein situation will be definite progress. I think seeing Roman Polanski finally being not accepted anymore in Hollywood is recognition of these past cases, and that's a start. And what we're seeing right now ourselves is we're seeing more people contact us. We're getting far more information than we've ever gotten before. We're seeing reporters finally have the courage, or editors, it's more about editors, have the courage to actually start publishing some articles. It's nice to see the LA Times. I think it's Gus Robert Garcia just did an article last week that was great about Brian Claflin and his relationship to Gary Goddard. So it was great to finally see the LA Times start to pick up on these things. And I saw that the LA Times was the place that broke Harvey Weinstein's going to be turning himself in tomorrow. So I think we're in talks. We know that there's another big article coming out in June with a major publication that we've been talking to for several months. So on that end, I do think the reporting, Ronan Farrow, he did a lot. I mean, what he did was amazing. And again, you can see even with Ronan, who's well-known, established in the industry, respected as a journalist, who was working at MSNBC, and even MSNBC wouldn't put out all the information he had. So he had to go to the New Yorker. And that's very similar to what we've experienced, is people just afraid to start telling the truth. So we're just keeping this project alive, and we're putting these people in touch with other reporters, and in some instances, whether, with the police, if there's something to report. And right now, we're just waiting on a few other investigations to wrap up before we come forward with some additional information that we have. And we're confident that this issue isn't going away. If there's any good news, it's not going away. It survived their attempt to put this situation down, to not let us get the information out there. So now it's going to get out there. It's just a matter of time and persistence, and people like you taking the time to do a show on it and having us on. And that's why we do this, because it's word of mouth, and word of mouth is growing, and nothing is better than word of mouth.
Absolutely. So, Matthew, if people want to support the film, if people want to view the film and follow more of the work that you and the co-producer are doing, please, allow them to, inform them where they can find all of that.
Yeah, if they just hashtag an open secret, you'll find all the latest articles that we're doing. We're on Twitter at an open secret, and we're also on Facebook at an open secret doc. And every day there's new articles every day that we're putting out there, and we're starting to work, we're working with a whole group of new journalists we're reporting on this information on a daily basis. We're going on more podcasts. So definitely check out our Twitter feed at An Open Secret and our Facebook page. And we're also on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel where we post all our interviews, and I'll put this podcast, and that's An Open Secret YouTube channel. And they can just go down the rabbit hole of information that we have, and they will come away having zero doubt about what we've put in the film and about how bad this problem is, and it will change their perspective on this issue.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this interview, Matthew. I'll leave you with this thought. One of the things that parents look out for when they're trying to protect their children and ensure the best possible development of their children, they look out for environmental toxins, they look out for dietary toxins. What greater environmental toxin is there than allowing a child to go into a toxic environment full of predators? So the parents that are out there that are allowing their children into, and we're talking young and very young children, into the industry, I think based on what we've learned today, maybe you should think twice. Maybe you should keep a close watch and understand that it's not, the image that's portrayed through Hollywood and through sitcoms and through the media is not what's really going on behind the scenes. The word mind control, the phrase mind control is bandied about so often, and I think it's a loaded term. But as Matthew pointed out today, through the use of drugs, through the use of persuasion and manipulation, it's very easy to see how these children have been under a state of mind control, if you want to call it that. And in a similar way, I think these predators they have the public, they have the nation at large under a similar form of mind control, where they're gaslighting us and telling us that we're the crazy ones or we're the intolerant ones. And through a process, a slow boil of normalization, it's in my opinion and in my research, I've found that these predators, this network, is doing their best to normalize these behaviors because they understand that their time is running out and that there will be a mass awakening to this sort of twisted criminal behavior. And they want to get ahead of the curve and do their best to destigmatize it because they know that their ticket will soon be pulled. So Matthew, I just want to thank you again for taking the time today, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.